What is going on, gamers? Today I'm going to be talking about what I think the best factions to play are. I've played over 1,300 hours of legendary campaigns, so this will be based on my opinion. To address some elephants in the room, I would say I play Rome 2 differently than everybody else, or at least from what I've seen. Another thing is that some factions are clearly made better than others, so chances are some people won't agree with my ratings. And also to keep in mind that spear factions will play similar to another spear faction, and a sword faction will play very similar to another sword faction. To start this off, I'm going to be using Tier List Maker in a more simplified version. Instead of having a long list, we're just going to have 3 categories. So the 3 categories are: green category is to play, orange is to consider playing, and the red is don't bother playing at all. The first faction I'm going to cover is the Roman faction. So we have Rome, which is in the regular campaign. We have Octavian's Rome, Lepidus Rome, and Pompey's Rome, which are part of the free DLC. The Rome faction overall start is easy. You start with a lot of land here, and you're at war with the Etruscan League off the bat, which are a pretty weak faction to start off with. And let's check out their units. So Rome starts with the Hastati, which are pretty good against the Etruscan League, but when you go up to the barbarians, you're going to struggle a bit. So you're better off getting the Principes before you attack the barbarians, and by the time you can actually recruit these, you'll have plenty of income. You already start with a very generous amount, and once you get to a tier 3, well, you basically can beat any army. Your main kind of issues will be right off the bat. Usually Carthage will attack you, so that's another army, but they're mosely dealing with other factions down this way. Syracuse, there's the odd time where they might attack you. The barbarians might straight up attack you right off the bat as well, and you also have the Del Monte here, but overall Rome is actually pretty easy to do. As for Rome's cavalry units, we have our tier 2, which is the Equites, and then it jumps right up to a tier 4, which is Praetorian, which is one of the best cavalry in the game. But you can also go down the auxiliary route, which will give you different cavalry. And when it comes to the reforms that Rome has, you will get different cavalry units, which would be a little bit better than the counterpart. So for example, the Equites, they can go up to a reform unit, but it's still keep them in the same tier 2 class. One of the harder things about Rome is managing other parties, especially on legendary, which you get a -25 penalty. Eventually you will get 4 parties, so you need to spend a lot more resources managing other parties compared to other factions. Overall, Rome is a very good faction to play. They do start out with a more favorable position with a rich economy. They do have good units. The only real issue you'll have with Rome really is just the family system. But other than that, they are pretty fun to play, and for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play category. The other Roman factions, which is in Imperator Augustus DLC, have the exact same units and the same playstyle. The only difference is the starting location and allies. Octavian's Rome in my campaign was the hardest one, even though the initial challenge was easy, and Pompey's Rome was the easiest, even though the initial challenge was hard. The hardest thing about playing these factions is the other parties and the Roman families, which when you start this DLC, you actually have a major cultural aversion, negative bonus, debuff, whatever you want to call it, against other parties. Trying to get any kind of treaties after they break the initial one is very hard, and usually they won't get any peace treaties when you're at war with them, so you're basically fighting them to the death. Since they all play very similar and Octavian's Rome is in a more favorable position, I'd say to play Octavian's Rome and don't bother playing the other 2. Carthage is next, which they are one of the more major factions to play, and it could be one of the hardest campaigns to do since you are surrounded by untrustworthy factions, and usually you're at war with Rome pretty early on, so you have to invest a lot of resources to fight Rome. When you start as Carthage, your settlements are scattered everywhere. You got a navy there, you got another army here, and you are at war with the Turdetani, which usually you can just instantly peace treaty out with them if you didn't want to deal with them. Literally high, you can actually get some gold out of them as well. When I start my campaigns, I don't even bother with this. This here is just not worth it, especially on legendary, because you'll have to invest way too much resources to deal with public order. So you're best off just getting rid of it and then focusing either on Italia, or you could actually wipe out Libya to get Africa, because this is a lot of gold here. Basically, you want to go to the places which has a lot of gold. As for the surrounding factions like Massilia or the frickin' whatever the hell these guys' names are, they're untrustworthy, and usually, just like the Turdetani, you can just peace out with them instantly. Let's take a look at Carthage's units. So right off the bat, you can recruit the Libyan hoplites, which are terrible units. They're okay against the slave infantry, but overall they're actually pretty bad. And if you go to their barracks, Your tier 1 is giving you the Carthaginian hoplites, which are basically equivalent to the Greek hoplite. So when you go 1v1 against the Greeks with hoplites, battles are usually pretty close. You go to the tier 2 is when you get cavalry, which is basically like a citizen cav equivalence. And when you go to your tier 3, this is when Carthage starts to shine. So you have your pikemen, you have your swordsmen, and you have your elephants. Your pikemen are a good defensive unit, obviously, and you have your Libyan infantry. When you actually fight Rome, you're kind of at a disadvantage when you use the Carthaginian hoplites because swords are better than spears in the game. They just do overall more damage, and you want the Libyan infantry against Rome, which a lot of times they would get the next tier, so they wouldn't have a study, they'd have the Principes. That's when you would need the elephants to come into play. So you need to basically have a defensive line, and then you need your elephants to do all the damage, which this is where Carthage shines, is the elephant. You go up the next tier, you get the Sacred Band, which in my opinion, they're not that good for a tier 4 hoplite. They're actually kind of a little bit disappointing. And you get the African War Elephants. They're better off playing a little bit more defensively as opposed to aggressively. If you didn't want pikemen in there, then you could play a little bit different, but the Libyan infantry is only good to about mid-game, and then you have to switch to the Sacred Band because the Libyan infantry just doesn't have enough offensive stats over the Sacred Band. So what I usually do is I have pikemen, and then I have the Sacred Band, then I have elephants and cavalry as well. What you do is you let the enemy just get stuck into your infantry, and then you have the elephants come from behind, from the side, wherever. The only problem with elephants is that they do terrible in auto-resolve because they have a small number, and whenever they get hit with flame shot, they freak out, which I do have a video to explain how to exploit that. Carthage overall, it's when you hit tier 3 is when they actually start to shine. Just like Rome, Carthage does have a tough time actually handling the political parties here. As you can see, we got pretty unlucky in the rolls and we're all in the negative. So after the 20 turn of protection is over, every single family is going to be hitting us, and we're going to have to invest a lot of resources to actually manage this as well. Overall, Carthage is not a bad faction to play, and sometimes you can get extremely unlucky and get attacked from all sides, which does make this faction a little bit harder to play. Your tier 3 is when the fun starts. It's just hard to get to that spot, and for that reason I'm going to put it consider playing. It's not quite like Rome where it's fun right off the bat. You have to actually kind of build up to that spot. The next 4 factions you see are the barbarians. For starters, we have the Tylis faction. As for Tylis, when you start out, you're at war with Macedon, which is one of the more major factions, but they are usually at war here with the Greeks, so it's hard to say how this will develop. Once you take Pulpadiva, that's when it becomes actually a little bit harder because you have to manage Macedon from here, the Tribali from here, and the Adrician Kingdom from here. And the Adrician Kingdom usually likes to do a pelt to spam, which is a very hard army to beat. Now we'll take a look at Tylis' units. So we have the Celtic Warriors, which is a tier 1, and they are A tier in my books. They're extremely good, and especially they're extremely good against spears, so you'll be fighting a lot of Greek hoplites, which in the game swords beat spears. You go to your tier 2, this is where you get your spears, which I'd say don't even bother recruiting. The Thracian Warriors are good as a flanking unit, but their defensive stats are pretty terrible. And when you get to your tier 3 here, this is when Tylis really shines. The Tribal Warriors are S tier in my books. They are insanely good because of their defensive stats. They're not as good as the Oathsworn, which in my books, these are also S tier. They don't have the actual weapon damage or melee attack, but they have basically on par melee defense with the Oathsworn. So as for a tier 3 unit, these are extremely good. So S tier Tribal Warriors, S tier Oathsworn. They do have cavalry as well. Every faction has cavalry, obviously. Light Horse, which is basically average. Raiden Horseman, which is also average. And the Noble Horse, which would be an A tier. They have a lot of health, which is nice. As for the political parties itself, it is actually pretty easy to manage because you're not going to get the 4-party systems like Carthage and Rome is. Overall, Tylis is a pretty fun faction to play. They have good units throughout almost every tier except for their spear units. They're more known as a sword faction, and your swords are actually pretty good against the surrounding factions, which are mostly spear factions. And for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play category. Boii is next on the list. Boii does start off with a gold settlement and a walled settlement at the same time. The Boii does have the 2 settlements, so you have the gold settlement here, and then you have the walled settlement up there, which the nicest thing about a walled settlement is it's easier to defend. The gold settlement is good because it gives you a lot of gold, obviously. One of the hardest things about the Boii faction is going up against the Germanic tribes. You have way better units than the Germanic tribes because they start off with just club levies or some garbage spears, but the thing is kind of like once you attack one, they all kind of gang up on you, so you have to manage guys from here, and also from here as well. There's the odd times where their Vaci will attack you, or maybe even the Arnauts, which would just straight up just run this way. It's kind of hard to manage which way people are going to attack you from. Now we'll take a look at Boii's unit. So Boii's got the tier 1, which is the Celtic Warriors, which are pretty good. Tier 2, you have the Spear Warriors and Axe Warriors, which are both junk. Tier 3, you got the Veteran Spears, which are a little bit better than the Greek Hoplites, because the Greeks are more known for the hoplite. But overall, Veteran Spears not that great. You have the Sword Followers, which are one of the better mid-tier sword units. And then you have the Oathsworn, which is one of the best sword units in the game. As for the Cavalry, Light Horse, not very good. The Heavy Horse, they're not too bad. They do have a lot of health though. And the Noble Horse, like in my books, they're A tier. They're actually pretty decent. Similar to the Tylis faction, the overall family stuff is not too hard to manage. Overall, the Boii faction is not that bad of a faction to play. They do start off with gold and a walled settlement, which is good, but they're not in a very favorable position compared to the other barbarians. And for that reason, I'm going to put this in the don't bother playing. Next up, we have the Nervii faction. So this faction, you have to actually play these a little bit differently than your other barbarian factions because the units have a different play style. The Nervii faction does start off with a very weak settlement, which is glassware, and that's for research. You do have an ally with the Archibates, but what's going to make this faction hard is your starting location, which is a very common trend in basically most of the factions. The Fricii usually attacks you directly the next turn. The Cherokee and the Trevari, which usually fall up within the first, I don't know, 5 turns, maybe a bit more. The Iceni is usually pretty good. They never usually attack you. Now for the Nervii's units. So if we go to our tier 1 here, we have the Celtic Warriors, and the Spear Brothers are actually garbage, so don't even bother recruiting them. Your tier 2 and your tier 3 is how CA kind of wants you to play it. Unfortunately, it's not a very good play style. So you have your Naked Spears here, which is Frenzy Charge, and you go down to the next tier, which is your Fierce Swords, which has Frenzy. They want you to play ambushes only with this faction because of their charge bonuses. They have a pretty good charge bonus for melee infantry, and it can actually be increased further with your Warlord right here. You can just throw him in the army, and it can get a better charge bonus. But the problem is that the units are very weak. So if you do a Fierce Swords, so your mid-tier unit against another mid-tier unit, they won't actually perform very well. And if you go up to your tier 4, you got the Oathsworn, which are basically good units. Cavalry, you have your regular Light Horse, which is very good. Mighty Horse, which has pretty decent melee attack and weapon damage, but the rest of the stats are just average. And your Noble Horse, very good as well. Yet again, the family stuff is pretty easy to manage. To explain a little bit further on what I mean by ambushes and how you actually use their mid-tier units, here's a damage chart. So you have the initial damage and the damage over time. To start off, we are going down here, so you're running towards the units, you're running towards the units. You pop your abilities, and then the damage skyrockets. So it does a ton of damage, but this is for a short period of time. And what happens is the damage eventually falls off back to whatever their normal amount of damage would be, and then it kind of levels out, and then it falls down based on how tired they get. So the initial damage is literally right here, which unfortunately does not last long enough, and the units aren't actually strong enough to get a full value in this part of the curve here. So their actual mid-tier units are not very good at actually doing ambushes, unless you're fighting extremely weak units. After all that being said, I don't think the Nervii is really worth playing because the early game is not too bad, the mid game is actually not that great, but then the late game is actually pretty fun, and for that reason I'm going to throw them in the don't bother playing. To finish off the barbarians, we have the Arverni. The Arverni, in my opinion, has the best starting location for the barbarians because of the surrounding settlements. When you play the Arverni, you do start out with a gold settlement, which is actually pretty good, and you're also at war with the Adui, however you pronounce it. They are extremely easy to take out, so all you do is you do 1 turn recruiting, send both armies to auto-resolve, and you basically beat them. Now, what I mean this is the best starting location is because right next door you have iron, which gives you your bronze weapons and armor, and then you have timber, which gives you your tier 4s. The Arverni units. We've got the tier 1, which is the Celtic Warriors. Your tier 2 is Spear Warriors, which they're completely garbage. Don't bother recruiting them. Your tier 3 is the Chosen Swordsmen, which are a pretty good mid-tier unit. Chosen Spear, also do not bother recruiting them. Your tier 4, which is giving you the Oathsworn, which is one of the best sword units in the game. And the Spear Nobles, well, since you got Oathsworn as an option, the Spear Nobles are not as good of an option as the Oathsworn. And for their cavalry, you got the Light Horse, which is not very good. You got the Heavy Horse, which is decent. And then you got the Noble Horse, which is pretty good. Just like the Nervii, the political party system is actually pretty easy to manage. Overall, the Arverni is a pretty good faction to play. They do start out in a very favorable position, and for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play category. Now we're going to go to the successor kingdoms. To start off is Macedon. As Macedon, the initial challenge is normal, but I would have to disagree because you have bad relationships with all the Greeks here. You're at war with Tylis. You have the Adrian kingdoms, which usually declares a war you early, and also the Tribali as well. So you're basically surrounded by factions who would declare a war against you pretty early. Now for Macedon's unit. So let's go up to our muster field here, our tier 1. We have our regular hoplites, we got our levy pikemen. Now I haven't been mentioning much of the range units because they are overall not really worth mentioning. It's pretty much your melee infantry, which is going to do the bulk of the work. My opinion in pikemen they're pretty much good all around. Obviously the higher tier ones are better. Your hoplites, well, they're not actually all that great because when you fight Athens, they have the same thing, and when you have Sparta, they have better hoplites. When you're going against Tylis, well, they don't always recruit all swords, so you have the actual levy spears, which aren't very good. Against Tylis, they actually won't be too bad. When you go up the tier, you get a little bit better pikemen, the Carian axemen, which is basically like a ranged unit, like a peltas kind of, the Sarissa cavra, which is your shot cav, and your citizen cav, which is just your basic cav. In this tier, I would prefer citizen cav just because they don't have that much of a charge bonus as opposed to Sarissa cav, which is a shot cav, but citizen cavalry can do better in longer melee combats because a lot of the time you're busy doing something else, and if you leave shot cav in battle, they perform very terrible. You go to your tier 3. Now this is where you kind of skyrocket in actual damage. So you have the thorax pikemen, which are good pikemen, the thorax swordsmen, which are pretty good swordsmen. They're not really like the best in class kind of swordsmen, but the thorax, in my opinion, in general, are like a good overall unit. You have the Thurio spears, which there's really no point in recruiting those, in my opinion. The Aristian, I cannot pronounce that cavalry, which is your next tier of shot cavalry, and then this is when you get your skirmish cavalry here. And when you go to your tier 4, this is when you're going to deal all the freaking damage here. You've got foot companions, which is one of the best actual pikemen in the game. The shield bearers, which is not the best hoplite in the game, but it's one of the best. You have the royal peltas, which is actually pretty good. They do have like a javelin. They're kind of like a peltas, so like a ranged, but they're still considered melee, so they only have a couple volleys, then the range is gone, but they have actually really good stats overall. The companion cavalry, which is probably one of the best shot cav, and then you have the Aspis cavalry, which does have very good attack. Like for a cavalry in just like a regular one is very good. As for the other parties, it won't be too hard to manage. Overall, Macedon is a decent faction to play. However, compared to other successor kingdoms, they aren't as fun. Macedon does have some decent units, and for that, I put this in the consider playing. Next is the Seleucid Empire, which the Seleucid faction is actually pretty fun to play, but does have a little bit of a tough start. When you start as the Seleucid faction, it says the initial challenge is normal, which I 1000% disagree. You go to diplomacy here, you have a dictionary of satrophies, which within the first few turns, they usually turn on you, or if you attack someone else and you try to bring them in, they usually would just break their trees with you. Also, you're at war with the Quidri. Also, within the first few turns, Egypt would usually declare war at you, or Nabataea. Your overall situation here is not very good. When we go to Seleucid's units, they do have a lot of units which can be very confusing, but when we start with our tier 1, we have just our basic units, and the thing with some of the surrounding factions is they're cavalry with a little bit of melee infantry, but highly mobile armies. So when you have your regular infantry units going up against mobile units, it doesn't usually work out too well. We go to our tier 2, we have your basic cavalry and a basic camel spear. We have the Persian hoplites, which are not very good, and your pikemen, well, you can really do a whole campaign with these pikemen. Now you go to your tier 3, which is when Seleucid starts to shine a bit. You have your Indian war elephants, which are OP, and you have your thorax swordsmen, thorax pikemen, which, like I said previously, in my opinion, the thorax units are like a good value unit. They're not like best over another, but they're good value. And you go up to your tier 4, which is when you just get insanely good units. You have the silver shield pikemen, one of the best pikemen in the game. Silver shield swordsman, one of the best swordsmen in the game. You do have these shield bearers just like Macedon. You have the royal peltas, which these are considered a melee unit, not a actual range unit, but they have really good stats. You have the Indian armored elephants, which are the best elephants in the game. They're extremely OP. They have a ton of armor and ton of health for elephants. And then you have the Hellenic cataphracts, which are the thick boys. They are extremely slow, but they hit like a freaking truck. We're gonna go up to the range category here, which I'm gonna skip skip the first two because there's nothing real special. But we have the Syrian heavy archers, which have a ton of abilities. So precision shot, flame shot, whistling shot, heavy shot. Precision shot's decent. Flame shot is good for other elephants or even towers. Whistling shot is for morale, which is basically pointless. Heavy shot is better for close range. The Syrian heavy archers overall are a pretty good range unit. And when we go to the actual cavalry units, this is when you get a little bit mixture of both. I still would just go with regular citizen cav for tier 2. Tier 3 is going to give you your regular elephants. Well, not regular, actually. Regular for them anyways. And your tier 4 is going to give you a bunch of different options here, which the Azat Knights, I would say they aren't as superior as the Hellenic Cataphracts. Overall, right off the bat, families aren't too bad. You start with 2, but as you go further in the campaign, it will get a little bit harder. The Seleucid faction is a fun faction to play. The start will be a little bit hard, but once you can get over the Satrapies and everyone trying to declare war against you, it's actually a lot of fun. You have a lot of good units, and for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play. Next on the list is Baktria, which you do start at a corner of the map, and it also has a very similar playstyle to the Seleucids. When you start with Baktria, you do have 4 settlements, and one of them is actually a gold settlement, which is actually extremely good for income. And as you can see on the bottom right here, our income is actually extremely good. And when you look at the other factions around you, they're all pretty weak factions, and I was able in my campaign to just sit there, get the units I wanted, and then start attacking. When it comes to Bactria's units, it's very similar to Seleucids. It's actually just a little bit less units. So this is your tier 1 levy pikemen, each javelin, axemen. Tier 2, obviously nothing too special, pikemen, citizen cav. Tier 3, you have the thorax pikemen, thorax swordsmen, the scale thorax hoplites, which are not as good as the thorax swordsmen, and Therios spears, which are obviously, in my opinion, not a good pick. You have the Indian war elephants, OP units, obviously elephants. And then your tier 4, the better elephants. You have the Bactrian Royal Guard, which is a decent hoplite. I wouldn't say it's one of the best hoplites, but overall it's pretty decent. And you have the Hellenic Cataphracts, which are pretty good cavalry units. The ranged units, it's pretty much only the elite Persian archers. Precision shot, flame shot, whistling shot, heavy shot. Very similar to Seleucids. And when you go to their stables, they have a couple of units. So the Bactrian horse archers, that's like a specific one. And then you got elephants. And then you have the Royal Cavalry, which the Hellenic Cataphracts are a better option. When you go to the tier 3, you have the Bactrian Noble Horse, which is a bit better than like the Citizen Cav, for an example. When it comes to the other parties, you won't have a hard time managing them. And actually, your rolls will actually be pretty good. Like here we're +5, which normally in a lot of campaigns, it's usually in the negatives. Bactria does have some decent units. You do start with a ton of income. However, they are more of like a streamlined version of Seleucid. I wouldn't put them under the play, but I would put them in the consider playing if you wanted a little bit more simpler version of the Seleucids. The final faction for the successor kingdoms is Egypt. Egypt, you do start out with a bunch of settlements, which 2 of them are grain fields, which is very good settlements, and you also start out with the Iron Workshop, which gives you your bronze weapon and armor. When you're looking at the surrounding factions, you have Syrinka, which owns these settlements here, so you could actually wipe them out pretty early to get even more gold, and then you can expand down to the south here, which Kush is here. Kush is likely to attack you very on. It just really depends. Nabataea also in the same boat, but when you're going to look up at the Seleucids here, they are most likely willing to attack you within the first few turns. You do also have a satrapy of Cyprus, which usually a lot of factions would attack them early as well, so you can either join or not join them. I mean, in my opinion, I'd say don't bother joining them, just kind of break the trees with them as soon as they get attacked. When you look at Egypt units, their tier 1 is actually all pretty bad units. If you go up to tier 2, it actually starts to get a little bit decent. You have the Galatian swordsmen, which aren't too bad against the surrounding factions. Tier 3 is when you get the thorax and elephants, so really once you get to tier 3, you're basically starting to kick off. And then you get to the tier 4, which gives you some of the best units in the game. Obviously, you have the Hellenic Royal Guard, one of the best pikemen in the game, Royal Peltas, the Royal Thorax swordsmen, Galatian Royal Guard, which in my opinion, the Galatian Royal Guard is the better option of the 2, but the Royal Thorax swordsmen look cooler. You have the African war elephants, which elephants are OP, and the Ptolemaic cavalry, which is also decent as well. When it comes to the other parties, you really won't have to worry about too much. Egypt's actually pretty easy to do. Overall, Egypt is a decent faction to play. They have weak starting units, but they do have good starting settlements. And the nice thing about where they are is a lot of the factions there start out pretty weak, and it's only really to the late game where they actually would get good units. But for the vast majority of the time, a lot of the units are actually weak. I wouldn't say they're as fun as the Seleucids, so I put these in the consider playing category. The next faction category we have is the Desert Kingdoms, kingdoms, which the first one on the list is Kush. When you start out as Kush, you do start out in a nice corner of the map, and to the south you have Axum, which is a very weak faction. They usually declare war against you fairly early, and in my campaign I pieced out with them basically instantly, and they paid me for it too. And to the north you have Egypt, which you want to be taking out Egypt as soon as you can because Egypt has a lot of good settlements. Nabataea is usually pretty good. You do actually start with a trade agreement with them, so they're not usually likely to attack you. If we take a look at Kush's units, we have, this is your tier 0 units, so you got the slave slingers, slave infantry, Nubian spearmen, which they're okay against the surrounding factions, but you're better off waiting until at least your tier 1, which is going to give you the swordsmen, which are actually pretty decent, and they're actually decently cost as well. Archers, they're also pretty decent. Tribesmen, don't even bother recruiting those. Your tier 2 is giving you your only set of pikes that you can get. The Nubian bowman, which is just your basic bowman with just a little bit more range. You go to your tier 3, which is going to give you the Kushite archers and the shuttle warriors. Leopard warriors, don't even bother recruiting those. Your shuttle warriors are a better option. Unfortunately, the shuttle warriors, in my opinion, were actually kind of disappointing, as this is like a faction-specific unit. The Kushite archers, though, they're actually pretty good. They have above average missile damage and above average range, and they also have a little bit of abilities as well. Go to the tier 4, you have the Royal Kushite archers and the armored shuttle warriors. So basically just an armored infantry version of both. That's pretty much it. The Royal Kushite archers do have the heavy shot, which is good for close range. And if we go to the cavalry section, so you have desert cavalry, which is not very good. The problem with the cavalries is they have almost no armor, so their survivability is not all that great. They do have relatively decent melee stats, but defensive stats not very good. You can go to 2 different routes. You have the animal studs, which gives you the elephants, or you can go down to the horse studs, which gives you the Royal Kushite Guard, which are actually a extremely good cavalry. They have very good attack, and you have the size chariots, which are basically OP. When it comes to the other parties, you won't have too hard of a time, and it's actually one of the more easier ones to do. Overall, Kush is a fun faction to play. They start out in a very favorable location, and they have weaker factions surrounding you. Egypt's right next door, so once you wipe them out, you do have access to a ton of resources. They do have a bunch of good units as well, especially the late game, which you will steamroll through basically everything. And for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play category. The final desert kingdom we have is Nabataea. When you start Nabataea, you do start off with a few treaties. So you do have a treaty with Egypt, you got a treaty with Kush, and a treaty with Mayan right next door. Right off the bat, your only real kind of thing to worry about is Seleucid. But in my campaign, Kush actually attacked me. So what I did was I got my units, went down this way, took out Kush, took out Axum, and then went right for Egypt. Similar to the Kush campaign, what you want to do is you want to push down this way to secure this, and then you want to make your way all the way up to Egypt, because this is going to give you a lot of gold and good resources here. If we take a look at Nabataea's units, their tier 0s are garbage. Their tier 1 is also garbage, the Levy Spearmen. I wouldn't even bother recruiting that. When you go to their tier 2, you get their first set of pikemen and the Nabataea swordsmen, which are okay. They will struggle against the surrounding factions. When you go to your tier 3, you have the noble swordsmen, which do have good attack, but their defensive stats are actually pretty terrible. They have the Nabataean heavy archers, which are pretty decent, and the heavy desert spearmen, there's really no point in recruiting that. You go to your tier 4, you have the Rechem Palace Guard, which is one of the best hoplites in the game. Now, they have a branching path here, which is the Hellenic route, which the only real reason why you go the Hellenic route, in my opinion, would be for the pikemen. When it comes down to the other parties, you actually won't have too bad of a time, and one of the benefits to the very first ones is like Greeks. So what you can do is, if you want, you can actually just send a 1 navy up to Knossos and up to here, and to get trades or some kind of treaties with them, so that will improve your relationships with this family here. Overall, Nabataea does have very weak early game units, okay mid-tier units, and it's only really once you hit the last tier of units do you actually start having fun, and for that reason I'm going to put them in the don't bother playing category. The next 5 factions you see are the Greek states, and we'll start off with Athens. When you start out at Athens, you are a client state of Macedon, which early game, either one of you would end up breaking the treaties. You have Epirus here, which you're at not good relations with, and Sparta is actually war with Epirus, so you could help Sparta, help take out Epirus to kind of get a better foothold, but eventually you'll have to wipe out Sparta and Macedon. When you took a look at Athens units here, we have your regular hoplite, light hoplites, which are junk, and the range that Athens has is also junk, so I'm not even going to bother going over that. Your tier 2 is when you get your first set of pikemen and your first set of cavalry, which is just both at average. Your tier 3 is the Tarentine, which is your average skirmish cav. You do have the thorax swordsman, which will do a lot more damage than your actual hoplites will. As soon as you can get the swordsman to replace the hoplites, it's totally worth it. The Thurios hoplites are junk, Thurios spears are also junk. And when you go to the tier 4, you have the thorax hoplites or the picked hoplites, which there's no point in actually using the thorax hoplites. By the time you get your tier 4, everyone else, including the barbarians, will have better units than your tier 3. Since the barbarians are mainly sword factions, your thorax swordsman is basically going to fall off. You actually have to have a little bit more tankier unit. And one of the downsides to Athens is by the time you actually start to take out the barbarians, there will always be some that will have Oathsworn, which Oathsworn are some of the best sword units in the game, and they will actually just shred your hoplites. You have the Hippeus Lancers, which are a decent shot cav. One of the things that sucks about Athens is they don't really have like a good damage dealing unit. That's one of the biggest problems with this faction. When it comes to the family stuff, you will find it a little bit harder than average to maintain this. Overall, Athens isn't really a fun faction to play. They have a lot of just generic boring units, and the late game units are also boring as well. And because of that reason, I'm going to put this in the don't bother category. Next up on the list is the Epirus faction. When you start out as Epirus, it is a pretty hard start because you're at a major disadvantage. You're at war with Sparta. You've got Athens who hates you. Macedon is also unreliable. Arverni hates you. Rome hates you. Syracuse also hates you, so you're at risk of being attacked from basically every single front. When it comes to Epirus' units, your tier 1, you have regular hoplite, you do have levy pikemen, and then the other 2 units here are basically garbage, don't bother recruiting those. So you do have a little bit advantage over Athens because of levy pikemen. When you go to your tier 2, you get your regular pikemen, your first cav, and axemen, which is garbage, don't bother recruiting those. Your tier 3 is when you get a little bit better cavalry, and when you go to your tier 4 is when Epirus pretty much really shines. So you have the Hellenic Royal Guard, which is one of the best pikemen in the game, and then you have the Royal Peltis, which would be, they're technically a melee infantry. They do have javelins. It's only like 2 volleys, so it's not much, but this would be your next kind of like units in line next to the Hellenic Royal Guard, because when you start getting to mid to late game, your regular hoplites don't cut it, so that's when you need the Royal Peltis. Except the problem with this here is armies are extremely expensive. You have the Aspis Companion Cavalry, which is your regular cavalry, and you have the Hellenic Royal Cavalry, which is your shot cav. Your Aspis is probably the better choice because Epirus does actually have, though, faction-specific mercenary Indian war elephants. Unlike Athens, once you get to late game, you won't be able to deal a lot of damage. This actual elephant negates that damage. As for the other parties, depending on how lucky you will get, sometimes you could get lucky, but overall, it's actually a little bit harder to manage. Overall, Epirus is in the same boat as Athens, where the early to mid game is not very fun. It's only until you get to the late game does Epirus actually shine, but with the hard start and the family stuff you have to deal with, it's overall not a fun faction to play, and for that reason, I can put that in the don't bother playing category. And now for my favorite faction in the game, Sparta. Sparta was the very first faction I've played in Rome 2, and I've done 3 campaigns with them. The Sparta faction was the reason why I bought Rome 2 in the first place, because I think Spartans are freaking cool. When you start out as Sparta, you get one of the worst settlements in the game other than the actual horse factions, which get even worse ones. You're at war with Epirus, and when you play as Sparta and you attack Epirus, you have to do big brain strats. Macedon will basically always want to jump in after you. Now for Spartans units, you have the Perioiki, which in my opinion aren't very good, and they're not really a good solution to go up against Epirus, Macedon, or even Athens. So I usually do not use those units. I will usually just wait and camp until I can get the Spartan units, because anything with the Spartan name in it will basically last until the last freaking unit. What I'm getting at is anything with Spartan in the name is insanely good. This is the best hoplite faction in the game, and the only other thing is that everything else that Sparta has is basically garbage. When it comes to family stuff for Sparta, it really kind of depends. I know a couple campaigns I had where it was actually pretty decent, but I remember one where it was an actual nightmare. Overall, Spartan, like I mentioned, is my favorite faction in the game. The Sparta has insanely good hoplites. The challenge of it, though, is that it's a very hard start. It's one of the hardest starts in the game, and for that reason, I'm going to put them in the play category. Next up on the list is the Massilia faction, or the faction that loves to trade. When you start out as Massilia, you do start out with a walled settlement, which is actually pretty good for a starting settlement. Income is about average, but the thing with Massilia is that you do have a positive diplomat bonus to all factions, so there usually would be a cultural aversion faction which would be in the negatives, but in the case of Massilia, that's basically negated. And you also do have a 20% bonus to trade. Early game is not really that effective, but once you start to go to mid to late game is when you just get a crazy amount of gold from trades. When you look at Massilia's units, it's a bit of a mix of Celtic and Greek. So you have the Celtic warriors, which are the better option to start off with when you first start recruiting. You go to your tier 2, you're going to get the basic light horse, which is not very good. And you have the citizen cav, which is your average cavalry. You go to your tier 3 is when you get the thorax swordsman, which is actually pretty decent. Every faction that has the thorax is basically a tier 3. You have the Thurio spears and the Massilian hoplites, which the Massilian hoplites are a decent tier 3 hoplite. When you go to your tier 4 here, it's only cavalry. Basically what I'm getting at here is once you hit tier 3, that's literally it. When it comes to the other parties, this is one of those again where you could get unlucky, but for the vast majority of the times, it's actually relatively normal. Overall, Massilia does have a relatively easier start. You get a lot of bonuses, but once you start hitting the mid to late game is when Massilia falls off. They don't really have a good tier 4 solution, but overall, I'd say don't bother playing the faction because it's relatively boring. And finally, in the Greek states is the Syracuse faction, or what I like to call the sandwich faction. When you start out the campaign with Syracuse, you are right next to Carthage and Rome, which is why I like to call this the sandwich faction, because it is quite possibly that both of them will attack you, and when that does happen, you're better off just restarting the whole campaign. But in my case, it was Rome that attacked me, and I ended up being pretty much good relationships with Carthage. When you take a look at Syracuse's units, it's pretty well a copy-paste with Athens. So you have your regular hoplites, you have your light hoplites. Tier 2 is your pikeman cavalry. Tier 3 when you get the thorax, so that's when you actually start doing a little bit of damage. Your Thurios, not very good. Tarentine, that's your very first skirmisher cav. Tier 4, you get the picked hoplites and the thorax hoplites, which there's no point in using these because you're going to need something a bit more tanky. When I was attacked by Rome, what I did was I recruited regular hoplites and the pikemen, and then I basically rushed up and fortified because Rome was sending a couple armies at me, which if I didn't do that, then I probably would have lost. When it comes to other parties, you won't have a tough time managing it, but when you look at the Disciples of Zeus, it has Xenophobe, which is -2 loyalty for every faction. So once you start getting to the mid game, you generally want to have almost no treaties with anybody. Overall, Syracuse does play very similar to Athens. You have the exact same units, just different starting locations. They're not a very fun faction to play, and for that reason, I'd say don't bother playing. And now next up on our list is the Pontus faction. When you start out as Pontus, you are at war with two factions. So you have the Cappadocia and Crimea up here. They usually take a little longer to get down to you because Colchis or even the horse factions up here will actually declare war against them. But Cappadocia is your main threat. Cappadocia doesn't really have good units. Bithynia is also an ally with you defensively, which they do get attacked by Galatia early on in most cases. When you take a look at Pontus's units, your tier 1, you got regular hoplites, levy pikemen, which are actually pretty good around here because they mainly recruit Eastern Spearmen in a lot of the factions. When you go to your tier 2, that's when you get the pikemen and the Pontic swordmen, which is actually relatively decent for a tier 2. You get the Cappadocian cavalry in tier 2, which is actually a pretty good cavalry for tier 2. And you go up to a tier 3, which is the blood cavalry, which is like a better value unit over the Cappadocian cavalry, but you're still better off with the Cappadocian cavalry. Thurio spears, not very good. Go to your tier 4 is when you get the bronze shield pikemen, which is one of the best pikemen in the game, and the Pontic roll cavalry. When you're going to your archer camps, it's basically once you hit a tier 2, that's literally all you need. You get Eastern archers, which do have decent range, a little bit above average missile damage. When it comes to the other parties, you'll find it actually a little bit harder to manage over other factions. Overall, Pontus does have some decent units, but at the end of the day, I don't really think it was quite that fun of a faction just because their units end up being boring in the end. And for that, I put this in the don't bother playing category. Next on the list, we have the Iceni, which is one of the more unique factions in Rome 2. When you start off as Iceni, you start in a island, which you're at war with the Demetae, which is not a very hard faction to beat. You do have the Demnomni and the other factions here, which could declare war against you, but when it comes to the faction on the mainland, you're usually pretty safe. They don't usually attack you. If you take a look at Iceni's units, our tier 1 is the Sword Band. Now, Iceni's units are not as good as the the barbarians units. So we'll get that out of the way right now. You go to your tier 2, you have the spear band, which is insanely terrible for a tier 2, so don't even bother recruiting those. Your tier 3 is when you'll actually start to pop off, but what you do have is the chariots, and now the chariots are insanely overpowered. They are your ticket to winning pretty much every single battle. When you go to your tier 4, you have the heroic nobles, which aren't as good as the Oathsworn. Now if we go to the cavalry, we have the Britain Scout Riders, which are terrible units. We got the Veteran Riders, which are below average, and the Heroic Riders, which are in the same boat. They're not as good as a lot of counterparts. When it comes to the other families, you will have a tough time dealing with it. It's not so much the first one, but it's usually the second one. And I got extremely lucky one time when I got a double pacifist as trait, so I got completely screwed there. Overall, Iceni at first isn't all that fun of a faction because their early game units aren't really that great. But once you get the tier 3 and tier 4 is when Iceni really shines. So once you actually control all of the islands is usually when you get your tier 3 units. And for this reason, I'm going to put this in the play section. The final faction on the list is the Royal Scythians, or what I like to call the Horse Losers. The Royal Scythians is the only horse faction that I played, so I can't really compare it to another one, but I think this is probably the easiest based off of the starting traits, and you can actually get an additional 25% more ammo. You're not at war with anybody, but the horse faction, however you pronounce it, is likely to declare war against you, or also Chimera as well. When you take a look at the Royal Scythians armies, they have two different barracks. So you have one for the ranged cavalry and one for the melee cavalry, which the very first two tiers, so tier 2, tier 3, are your shock cavalry, and then your tier 4 is just your regular horse cavalry. So obviously, when you go up a tier, it's a little bit better. And when you go over to the ranged one, it's pretty well the same thing. You have the Amazonian riders, which are a little bit more range damage but less armor, and the armored horse archers are a little bit less range damage but more armor, and it's got a lot more different types of ammunition. You go up the tree, it's the same thing, just armored, and then you go up the tree again, literally just the same thing, just a more armored version. And you have the Royal Skirmishers. Yet again, they have a bunch of stuff, but I don't usually use skirmishers at all just because their ammo is pretty small. When it comes to the other parties, at least in my campaign, it actually wasn't too bad. Overall, the Royal Scythians is a terrible faction to play. I do not recommend it. They are actually a very hard and micro-intensive faction to play, and for that reason, I'd say do not bother playing it. Alright guys, I hope you found this video helpful. I have many hours in total Rome 2, so hopefully by watching this video, you can make a more informed decision on what faction is worth your time to play. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. Peace out.